Likeable leaders. Our STV poll reveals voters are more satisfied with Ruth Davidson than Nicola Sturgeon. And there's no post-Brexit surge for independence. We assess the findings. Scottish Tory leader Ruth Davidson's satisfaction rating among voters is much higher than the First Minister. The findings in a poll for STV also reveal support for independence has risen only marginally in the wake of the vote to leave the European Union. Analysis coming up. But first, here's STV's political editor, Bernard Ponsonby.
There was a time when the satisfaction levels with Conservative leaders was quite literally through the floor. The mere mention of Tory politicians brought a bristle of indignation. Our Ipsos Mori poll suggests that a radical change could be underway. 54% are satisfied with the job Nicola Sturgeon is doing, 40% dissatisfied, giving her a score of plus 14. But that's 22 points down since April. Ruth Davidson's approval ratings are a massive plus 31, 17 points higher than April. Kes Dugdale continues to poll badly, with a score of minus 10. But there is better news for Willie Rennie and good news for Patrick Harvey, who continues to have high satisfaction ratings. David Cameron continued the trend of Conservative Prime Ministers who didn't resonate with the Scottish public. Not any longer, according to this poll. Theresa May has a satisfaction rating of plus 16, as opposed to a disastrous rating of minus 26 for Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn.
It's the first time I can remember such a massive gap from a UK Conservative leader to a UK Labour Party leader. I think people in Scotland understand that the only people able to take this SNP government on are the Conservatives. I think what's also important is that we see that there's been no bounce for independence over the summer, and that a majority of Scots have no wish to be dragged back to a divisive referendum.
The Brexit vote has changed the terms of politics, but not radically altered opinion on independence, according to a poll. A clear majority of Scots don't want a second independence referendum. But of those who say they are certain to vote, if such a poll was called, 48% would back independence, 52% would oppose it.
We welcome this poll. It shows that support for independence is up and growing. It shows since Brexit the people have moved from no to yes, and it's incredibly close. And if you take out the margin of error, it's probably a dead heat.
A clutch of polls has now established a trend. Some no voters are prepared to back independence post-Brexit, but not in large enough numbers that would convince Nicola Sturgeon that a second plebiscite could be won.
Well, joining us now from Edinburgh is the Scotland editor of The Spectator, Alex Massey. Here in the studio, Mark Diffley, Research Director of Ipsos Mori Scotland, and journalist Kathleen Nutt, who writes for The National. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Mark, let's look at the satisfaction ratings here. Voter satisfaction with Ruth Davidson is higher than Nicola Sturgeon. But Nicola Sturgeon has enjoyed immense popularity for quite a long time, hasn't she?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. What we tend to see are two things. The longer you're on the political scene, and particularly if you're in a position of power, then, you know, the magic rubs off after a while. It rubbed off Tony Blair, it rubbed off other sort of popular leaders who started out kind of untouchable. And I think with the First Minister, although we have seen a bump in her satisfaction ratings this time, her sort of the bigger picture, I suppose, along a period of time is of a politician who is still pretty popular, considering how long she's been around, and also she's in charge now. She's the one that has to make the tough decisions. Obviously, often the boss kind of gets it in the neck, and we may be seeing a little bit of that, of course.
Kathleen, would you agree with that? Then she's kind of paying the price for that almost.
I would agree with that. Mark saying that she's in her third term. The SNP is in the third term of government now. Is a time when traditionally popularity for UK for government leaders is very difficult, and she's also been a very difficult time economically. Scottish government budget has fallen, and they've had to make very difficult decisions over over public spending, and I think actually the fact that she still maintains 14% positive ratings is actually pretty impressive given these difficult times and the fact that the SNP is in government for been in government for 9 years.
Alex Massey, is it pretty impressive considering what's going on around her?
Well, in one sense, yes, it is. I mean, of course, Nicola Sturgeon had an enormous surge in popularity as soon as she succeeded her predecessor, because she began with the inestimable advantage of not being Alex Salmond, and that was worth about 20 points in the approval ratings for her, I would suggest. But of course, yes, time is the great enemy of all politicians when it comes to maintaining their popularity. But what we also see here, I think, is proof of how the referendum continues to define Scottish politics. Nicola Sturgeon has a satisfaction rating of about 85% amongst yes voters, obviously much, much lower amongst no voters. And one of the interesting things is the decline in her approval rating since April, i.e. since just before the EU referendum. And I would suggest that the fact that the way in which she hints and flirts with the idea of a second referendum has, if you like, hardened opposition to Nicola Sturgeon amongst no voters, and that no voters who were previously prepared to give Nicola Sturgeon the benefit of the doubt are now massively less inclined to do so, because every time she talks about a referendum, which most people don't want, and particularly no voters don't want, she reminds no voters that actually Nicola Sturgeon isn't necessarily a person with whom they can do business.
Kathleen, do you think that the idea or her talking about the prospect of a second independence has been damaging then in some quarters?
I don't believe so. I think that she's been very sensible in approach to Brexit. She's trying to find out what is going to happen to the country. We don't actually know to a certain extent. We don't even know when Article 50 is going to be triggered, and we don't know what sort of Brexit we're going to get. The indications are people are hopeful in Britain that the UK will be able to remain in the single market, although that's not the indications coming from Europe at all. So I think people are in a state of uncertainty, and I think the fact that the support for independence is as high as it is, 48%, is actually, pretty encouraging going forward.
Well, let's talk about the independence figures. The Brexit vote has changed the terms of politics, but not radically altered opinion towards independence, according to your poll, up 3% in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare the poll to the result of the referendum, which is now almost exactly 2 years ago, then that's right. But effectively, what that means is there's actually very, very little, if any, change in opinion. When we asked people whether the Brexit result had affected the way they thought about the independence question, and 15% of people said that it had. But contrary to expectations, that was in both directions of travel, and not overwhelmingly no voters now backing a yes vote. Actually, almost as many people had gone in the opposite direction. So, in the end, that was a bit of it's almost a zero-sum game, I think, and we're left in a position where we are pretty much where we were 2 years ago. I mean, I think until we know a bit more about the Brexit impact, and before any campaign for a second referendum is called, I suspect that's where we will continue to be.
But I mean, the facts, well, not the facts, but the poll is saying here that independence support is up 3% in 2 years. Alex, there has been a gain.
Well, yes, but that means it's broadly within the ballpark of where polls were in August and September of 2014. So there hasn't been any meaningful change in that regard. I think with regard to the impact or the possible impact of Brexit and so on, it is simply just far too early to say. It all depends how successful things are over the next 3, 4, 5 years and beyond. Only then, I think, we'll be able to have a meaningful analysis of the impact of Brexit. What I think we can say, however, even now, is that you can see that from an intellectual point of view, perhaps, the political case for independence is stronger, perhaps, than it was in 2014. But that has to be set beside and weighed against the fact that the economic case, judged by the Scottish Government's own figures, is enormously weaker than it was in 2014. And so there is a certain trade-off between these two positions, and that perhaps also helps explain why although there has been some movement from no to yes and some from yes to no, overall the picture remains fairly static.
I mean, the Brexit bounce has kind of fallen away, Kathleen, hasn't it?
It has fallen away since the immediate aftermath of the EU referendum, but only slightly by, I think it was like 2% or something, 2 to 4% it's fallen away. But overall, if we look back in the last 3 years, support for independence has grown by 14%. That means that support for the union has actually fallen by 14% in 3 years. And I believe that the movement is on the side supporting independence, as the full implications for Brexit are going to hit home, with possibly some firms moving out of Scotland if they don't believe that Scotland's going to be staying in the EU. Japanese government have already written to the Prime Minister saying that if they don't like the terms of Brexit, they will have to leave.
But these figures, and this is just one poll, just one moment in time, it's not enough to persuade the Scottish Government to go for another referendum, though, is it, on the basis
well,
of this?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, they've obviously got this listening exercise at the moment. The SNP have got listening exercise to reach something like 2 million voters over the next couple of months to gauge the opinion, and I mean that may play into what Nicola Sturgeon has decided to do going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think this barrier that they set, this hurdle of sort of 60% support for a yes vote over a period of a year or so, the reality is that will just never. I suspect that will never happen. So you're never going to reach that point. I mean, I don't think, the reality is it will always be a risk at whatever stage if a second referendum is called. You're never going to have all your ducks perfectly in a row.
Alex, just very briefly on the timing of a second referendum, your thoughts?
Well, most yes voters want another referendum in the next 2 years. A majority of them want that, and so on. But of Scots as a whole, the majority of Scots have no desire for another referendum within 2 years. To have one just 4 years after the first vote and so on, I think it sort of offends people's sense of fair play.
Okay, and we'll have to leave it there. But thank you all for joining us this evening. Still to come, Open Doors Day. More and more visitors are exploring historic buildings. But are we doing enough to safeguard Scotland's architectural heritage? First, the latest news and sport from your part of Scotland.